When John Moses Browning first sketched the idea of a half-inch caliber machine gun in the late 1910s, few could imagine that his design would one day become the heartbeat of American firepower. The First World War had revealed a brutal truth. Modern warfare demanded a weapon that could pierce armor, shred aircraft, and command respect from 1,000 yards away. Browning, already the father of the M1911 pistol and the .30 caliber machine gun, believed the future of war would belong to heavy bullets and unstoppable reliability. By 1921, his prototype of the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun roared to life for the first time. It was a monster, firing bullets the size of a man's thumb at speeds exceeding 2,900 feet per second. The sound wasn't just loud. It was elemental, a hammer of thunder that echoed across testing ranges. Each round could punch through steel, engine blocks, and even lightly armored vehicles. Yet, in the quiet halls of American military testing facilities, officers weren't entirely convinced. The Great War was over. Budgets were tight. What use did they have for such a massive gun? But Browning's vision was larger than any war. He knew the world hadn't seen its last conflict, and when that next storm came, America would need a weapon that could dominate both air and ground. That storm came in 1939. As Europe burned, the M2 was dusted off, retooled, and mounted on nearly everything that could move: jeeps, tanks, aircraft, and ships. By the time the U.S. entered the war in 1941, the M2 had become the universal symbol of American might. From the frozen tundra of the Ardennes to the blazing skies above Berlin, the .50 cal became a soldier's guardian angel. On every front, GIs knew the reassuring rhythm of its fire, a slow, deep thudding that cut through the chaos of battle. When you heard the deuce, one veteran recalled, you knew we had the upper hand. For American pilots flying B-17 bombers over Europe, the M2 meant survival. 10 to 12 guns lined the flying fortress, each one manned by a young airman barely out of high school. As waves of German Messerschmitts dove in, the sky erupted with .50 caliber tracers. Pilots described seeing the bullets tear through enemy wings, igniting fuel tanks, ripping through steel and flesh alike. You could feel its power in your bones, said Staff Sergeant Bill O'Hara, a tail gunner over Hamburg in 1943. One good burst and a fighter just disintegrated. On the ground, armored divisions found that the M2 could do more than defend, it could dominate. Mounted atop Sherman tanks, it was used to suppress enemy infantry, destroy soft targets, and even disable lightly armored half-tracks. German troops learned to fear its distinct crack. Reports from the Wehrmacht's front lines called it a devil's gun, too strong to be human. But what truly defined the M2 wasn't just its killing power, it was its endurance. Soldiers swore by its reliability. Mud, snow, sand, or rain, the gun simply refused to quit. Some units fired tens of thousands of rounds without a single jam. Mechanics often joked that the gun would outlive the tank it rode on. By 1945, the M2 wasn't just another weapon. It was a legend. It had shot down aircraft, defended convoys, and broken ambushes across every theater of war. Its steel body bore the marks of years of combat, yet it kept firing unshaken. When the war finally ended, generals and grunts alike agreed. No single gun better represented the American spirit: rugged, relentless, and devastatingly effective. The Germans had superior tanks, faster fighters, and precision engineering, but nothing matched the raw practicality and reliability of Browning's masterpiece. The M2 didn't just define American firepower. It became a symbol, a mechanical embodiment of determination. Even decades later, in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, soldiers still trusted the same weapon that had first been tested before their grandfathers were born. More than a century after Browning's first sketch, the M2 still fires on modern battlefields. Its voice remains the same, deep, thunderous, and unmistakably American. It is a weapon that transcended generations, outlived empires, and proved a simple truth: power, when perfected, never grows old. The story of the M2's creation is not just one of engineering, it's one of obsession. When John Moses Browning began designing the .50 caliber machine gun in the final months of World War I, he wasn't simply building another weapon. He was chasing perfection. The war had revealed a brutal gap. The existing .30 caliber guns couldn't stop the new era of armored vehicles and aircraft. Browning wanted a single gun powerful enough to destroy both. In his small workshop in Ogden, Utah, he drew the first sketches, a machine gun chambered for a bullet twice the size of anything used before. The ammunition itself was revolutionary. A 12.7 by 99 mm round that could pierce armor plates and engine blocks. To handle that power, Browning designed a massive recoil-operated system with the strength of a cannon but the precision of a rifle. By 1921, the first prototype roared to life. Witnesses said it shook the ground like thunder. Soldiers who tested it couldn't believe the sheer energy of each shot. The muzzle blast sent dust flying meters away. And yet it was smooth, controlled, and astonishingly reliable. The Army called it the Browning M1921, the ancestor of what would soon evolve into the M2. Still, perfection takes time. The next decade saw countless refinements. The weapon was made lighter, stronger, and simpler to maintain. Browning himself passed away in 1926, but his spirit lingered in every bolt and spring. Engineers at Colt and Springfield Armory carried on his vision, transforming the early prototype into a machine of unmatched power and endurance. By the mid-1930s, the improved version, now known as the Browning M2 Heavy Barrel, was ready. It fired up to 600 rounds per minute and could hit targets more than a mile away. American engineers called it the 50, but to the few foreign observers who saw it in action, it already looked like a monster. When war returned to Europe in 1939, the M2 was still being quietly tested and refined. But once America entered the fight, the monster was unleashed. It found its way onto nearly everything: the wings of P-47 Thunderbolts, the turrets of B-17 Flying Fortresses, and the pintle mounts of Sherman tanks and jeeps. For the German soldiers who first encountered it, the experience was unforgettable and horrifying. During the North African campaign in 1942, Wehrmacht units reported facing large-caliber automatic fire capable of penetrating vehicle armor. At first, they assumed it was a small anti-tank gun. Only later did they realize it came from a machine gun, a weapon they had no true equivalent for. On the front lines, the M2 proved it could dominate any environment. In the desert heat, it fired without jamming. In freezing Ardennes snow, it worked flawlessly. Mud, dust, or rain, it didn't matter. American troops quickly learned that their best defense was the gun's relentless offense. You could drag it through hell, one GI wrote, and it would still shoot straight. But it wasn't just the soldiers who noticed. German engineers were stunned by the weapon's simplicity. They had their own masterpieces: the MG-34, MG-42, and 20mm flak guns. Yet none matched the M2's combination of durability and versatility. Reports from captured enemy officers often mentioned the weapon with a mix of frustration and respect. One Luftwaffe technical officer wrote in 1943, "The Americans possess a machine gun that functions as both an anti-aircraft and anti-vehicle weapon. It is the ideal tool of war, and it terrifies our troops." In the skies above Europe, that terror became very real. German fighters diving on American bombers suddenly found themselves ripped apart by streams of .50 caliber fire. A single burst could tear wings off or shatter a cockpit. Pilots who survived such encounters described seeing tracer lines so dense they looked like glowing ropes stretching across the sky. The M2 had become something beyond a gun. It was a symbol of unstoppable industrial might. Each unit represented thousands of hours of American engineering, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and a philosophy of warfare built on reliability over refinement. Where the Germans relied on complexity, the Americans relied on consistency, and it worked. By 1944, the Germans had given the weapon a grim nickname, Der Schrecken, the Terror, not because it was the deadliest weapon of the war, but because it was everywhere. On the ground, in the air, on ships, wherever the Americans fought, the sound of the M2 followed. The monster that Browning had dreamed of decades earlier had finally come alive. Not in his hands, but in the hands of millions of soldiers who trusted their lives to his creation. It was the perfect blend of power, precision, and perseverance. And as the war reached its peak, the Germans learned an uncomfortable truth. This monster couldn't be killed, only feared. By 1942, the American war machine had found its voice, and that voice was the deep, thunderous roar of the Browning M2.50 caliber. What began as a ground weapon was now the most adaptable machine gun ever built, reshaped to serve every corner of the battlefield. From the dusty deserts of North Africa to the frozen skies over Europe, one gun had 1,000 purposes, and not a single rival could match it. The genius of the M2 was its simplicity. It could be mounted on anything: a jeep, a tank, a bomber, or a patrol boat, and still deliver the same devastating effect. Soldiers joked that the only thing it couldn't fit on was a helmet. Mechanics could disassemble it blindfolded. Gunners could fix it under fire, and commanders could trust it to perform in any climate on Earth. In a war where every bolt and spring mattered, this reliability made it priceless. On the ground, the M2 became the steel guardian of the American infantry. Mounted on jeeps and half-tracks, it tore through ambushes and stopped enemy counterattacks cold. In North Africa, GIs nicknamed it the Beast. Against German trucks, motorcycles, or even light armor, the heavy rounds shredded through metal as if it were paper. A German panzergrenadier who survived an encounter near Kasserine Pass wrote in his diary, "Their machine gun was not a machine gun at all, it was artillery. It destroyed our position in seconds." But it wasn't just ground combat where the M2 shined. In the air, it redefined aerial warfare. American engineers realized that this gun, with only minor modifications, could serve as both offensive and defensive armament on aircraft. The result was a revolution. The P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the B-17 Flying Fortress all carried the M2. Its accuracy and hitting power gave Allied pilots a level of dominance the Luftwaffe could hardly comprehend. A B-17 bomber typically carried 13 minutes and 2 seconds, each manned by a young airman barely in his 20s. These men fought not just the enemy, but freezing temperatures and thin oxygen at 25,000 feet. When German fighters attacked, the sky erupted with tracer fire. The sound of synchronized M2s, that heavy, rhythmic clatter, became the anthem of the bomber crews. Tail gunner Robert Ellis recalled, "You could feel it through the fuselage, like the heartbeat of the plane itself. When they came for us, the .50s answered." Each bullet, nearly 6 inches long, could rip through an aircraft's frame or ignite fuel tanks with terrifying ease. German fighters like the Bf-109 or FW-190, built for agility, weren't designed to withstand that kind of punishment. Pilots described seeing enemy aircraft literally break apart in midair after a sustained burst. The M2's destructive reach forced the Luftwaffe to rethink its tactics. Attacks became quicker, shallower, and far more cautious. The fear of the .50 cal was real, and it saved countless American lives. At sea, the M2 proved just as indispensable. Mounted on patrol boats and landing craft, it defended convoys from aircraft and small enemy vessels. During the D-Day landings, hundreds of M2s lined the decks of ships and Higgins boats, laying down suppressive fire as soldiers stormed the beaches. The weapon's booming presence helped carve a path through German defenses, giving American troops a fighting chance in the chaos of Normandy. In the Pacific, Marines mounted M2s on everything, from trucks to aircraft to improvised tripods buried in the sand. Against Japanese bunkers and machine gun nests, the .50 cal could blast holes through thick palm log fortifications. One Marine corporal on Saipan said, "It was the closest thing to carrying your own artillery. When it spoke, the enemy stopped moving." What made the M2 truly remarkable was its ability to unite every branch of the military under one standard of power. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines all trusted the same gun. It simplified logistics, training, and repair. It created a kind of mechanical language that every soldier understood, the rhythm of the Browning. It didn't matter where you fought. When the .50 cal opened up, it was instantly recognizable. By late 1944, the M2 had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of American versatility, a single design that could conquer land, air, and sea. Engineers called it a universal gun. But to the men who fought with it, it was something greater. It was their protector, their equalizer, and sometimes their only hope. When the war ended, generals marveled at how one design had adapted to every challenge the modern battlefield presented. The Germans had tanks, rockets, and jet fighters, yet it was Browning's half-inch machine gun that stood at the heart of every American victory. It was proof that true power didn't need to be complicated. It just needed to work, every single time. And as history would show, the M2 didn't just serve every role. It defined them. By the winter of 1943, American forces were pushing hard through Europe, and so was their trusted companion, the Browning M2. To the Germans, it was no longer just a machine gun. It was a symbol of relentless American pressure. Wherever the Allies advanced, the thunder of the .50 caliber followed. But this time, it faced its toughest challenge yet, the armor of the German war machine. The German Wehrmacht prided itself on engineering excellence. Their tanks, the Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger, were mechanical marvels, feared across the continent. Their armor could shrug off rifle fire, and even many anti-tank weapons struggled against their thick, sloped steel. But when American soldiers mounted the M2 on jeeps, half-tracks, and Sherman tanks, they found surprising ways to use it, ways the Germans never anticipated. Officially, the .50 cal wasn't an anti-tank weapon. But on the battlefield, theory rarely survived reality. In North Africa and later in Italy, American gunners discovered that the M2 could penetrate weak points, engine vents, vision slits, tracks, and exposed crew positions. Its armor-piercing rounds tore through lighter vehicles like the SD, KFZ, half-tracks, and reconnaissance cars with terrifying efficiency. It could peel them open like a can, one U.S. sergeant remembered. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in 1943, American units ambushed a German convoy using only jeeps armed with M2s. The heavy rounds ripped through trucks and supply vehicles, igniting fuel and ammunition. The survivors described it as a lightning storm, short, brutal, and final. The gun's deep, rhythmic beat echoed across the desert, leaving behind silence and smoldering wreckage. When the fighting moved to Europe, the M2 continued its evolution. On the beaches of Normandy, it wasn't used against tanks directly, but against everything that supported them: machine gun nests, supply trucks, and infantry columns. Its heavy fire cleared paths for advancing troops, suppressing German positions that even mortars couldn't silence. One Marine landing officer later said, "When you heard that deep thump, 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 you knew the way was being made clear." But the .50's reputation truly exploded during the push through France and Belgium. Mounted on Sherman tanks, it became the perfect secondary weapon, used to cut down Panzerfaust teams before they could get close enough to fire. In the hedgerows of Normandy, tank commanders often stood half-exposed from their hatches, manning the M2 themselves. They trusted it with their lives. Private Henry O'Donnell of the 2nd Armored Division recalled a night near St. Lo when his unit came under attack by German half-tracks. "I opened up with the .50 and watched sparks fly off their armor. Then the front of one just burst into flame. We later found out the rounds went through the radiator and into the fuel tank. After that, none of them got close again." The gun's psychological impact was as great as its physical one. German infantry learned to recognize its sound instantly, a slower, heavier cadence than their own MG-42. Many described it as a metal hammer that signaled certain death if you were caught in the open. Wehrmacht reports from late 1944 mention soldiers abandoning vehicles rather than face .50 cal fire, calling it unmenschlich, inhuman. Even the mighty Luftwaffe couldn't escape its reach. During the Battle of the Bulge, German planes flying low to strafe Allied positions were torn apart by the .50s mounted on ground vehicles. Gunners aimed by instinct, and the thick American rounds punched holes clean through aircraft fuselages. One German pilot who survived a crash near Bastogne later admitted, "The moment we saw tracers from the big guns, we broke away. Nothing could fly through that." The weapon's versatility continued to astonish. In towns and villages, it was used to collapse sniper nests hidden in church towers. In forests, it chewed through trees and cover. In frozen fields, it smashed open enemy machine gun bunkers. The gun was no longer just part of the battle, it shaped the battlefield. By early 1945, even German engineers acknowledged its effectiveness. A captured report from the Wehrmacht's technical branch stated, "The American .50 caliber machine gun has proven adaptable to all roles, from anti-aircraft to anti-vehicle. It is impossible to neutralize through conventional countermeasures." The M2 had become something the Germans respected and feared. Against tanks, it exploited weaknesses. Against men, it was unstoppable. Against morale, it was devastating. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and the war neared its end, the sound of the .50 cal had become part of the landscape, a deep, steady drumbeat of victory. It didn't destroy the German tanks outright, but it destroyed the world that protected them. Supply lines, convoys, command posts, nothing was safe from its reach. The battle between German armor and the American .50 cal was never a contest of equals. It was a contest of adaptability versus arrogance. And in that contest, the simple, unbreakable design of John Browning's masterpiece once again proved that brilliance often lies in simplicity. War is not only fought with bullets and bombs, it's fought with sound, fear, and memory. By 1944, every German soldier on the Western Front knew that one sound meant death was coming. It wasn't the shriek of artillery or the whine of dive bombers. It was deeper, slower, heavier, the rhythmic pounding of the American M2.50 caliber machine gun. To the men of the Wehrmacht, that sound was unmistakable. It rolled through the smoke of battle like distant thunder, a mechanical heartbeat that grew louder and louder until it swallowed everything. The Americans called it Ma Deuce, a nickname filled with affection, but to the Germans, it was something else entirely. They called it Der Hammer Gottes, the hammer of God. The fear began not with what soldiers saw, but what they heard. The M2's slow, deliberate rhythm contrasted sharply with the high-pitched buzz of the German MG-42. Where the MG-42 screamed, the .50 cal roared. Each shot cracked like a whip, echoing through valleys and across ruined towns. German veterans later recalled that the gun's sound seemed to vibrate through their bones. You could tell it was close when you felt your chest shake. wrote one infantryman of the 352nd Division defending Normandy. Frontline accounts show how the weapon shaped morale. At night, American units often fired short bursts from their M2S to test lines or suppress movement. To the enemy, those bursts felt like an unseen monster breathing in the darkness. Even when no one was hit, nerves frayed. Sleep became impossible. The psychological effect was deliberate domination through sound. The gun's terrifying reputation grew during the Normandy breakout. When Allied tanks rolled across hedgerows, the .50s mounted on their turrets opened up with crushing force. The bullets ripped through stone walls, vehicles, and men alike. Survivors described how the gun spoke in thunderclaps, tearing the air itself apart. German soldiers began calling the areas covered by .50 cal fire Todesfelder, fields of death. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, the M2 became a symbol of hope for the freezing, surrounded Americans, and a symbol of dread for the Germans pressing in. As the snow muffled other sounds, the heavy boom of the .50 carried for miles. Panzer grenadiers advancing through the fog sometimes stopped dead at the first burst, mistaking it for a much larger weapon. "You couldn't see it," said a German corporal captured near Bastogne, "but you knew it could see you." Psychological warfare wasn't always intentional, but its results were undeniable. German commanders noted entire platoons retreating under .50 cal fire, even when losses were light. The sound alone triggered panic. Wehrmacht reports described it as demoralizing and inhumanly powerful. Some units developed unofficial tactics. When they heard the deep stutter of the M2, they would drop flat, wait 10 seconds, and only move when the gun stopped, even if no bullets came their way. For American soldiers, the effect worked both ways. The sound of their own M2S inspired confidence. The familiar beat meant power, safety, and control. It was the sound of home, echoing across a foreign land. "That gun made us feel like giants," one U.S. machine gunner wrote after the war. "When you pulled the trigger, the whole battlefield seemed to listen. Even in the air, the M2 carried psychological weight." German fighter pilots who faced B-17 formations spoke of the invisible walls of tracers that filled the sky. The glow of .50 caliber rounds was visible for miles, forming streaks of red fire that seemed impossible to escape. "It was like flying into a furnace," said one Luftwaffe pilot who barely survived a mission over Bremen. In every theater, from Normandy to the Pacific, the M2's voice became synonymous with American dominance. Soldiers on both sides could recognize it instantly. It didn't chatter or shriek. It announced itself, deliberate and unyielding. The gun spoke in a language everyone understood: power. And as the war dragged on, the sound of the .50 cal carved itself into memory. Even decades later, veterans could recall it perfectly, that deep metallic rhythm that seemed to echo across generations. For some, it was the sound of salvation. For others, it was the sound of the end. But to all who heard it, one truth remained the same. When the M2 began to speak, you didn't have to see it to know your fate was already sealed. The battlefield had many terrors, but none that announced themselves so clearly. The M2 didn't just kill with bullets, killed with fear. By the middle of World War II, the German High Command understood one painful truth. The American M2.50 caliber machine gun was not just another weapon, it was a battlefield equalizer. Wherever the Americans went, this heavy gun followed, mounted on jeeps, tanks, aircraft, and even ships. Its destructive range and stopping power had become a nightmare for German infantry, vehicles, and low-flying aircraft. So the Wehrmacht tried everything it could to fight back. The first countermeasure was simple: armor. German engineers began reinforcing half-tracks, command cars, and light tanks with extra steel plates, hoping they could withstand the M2's punch. But the problem was physics. The .50 caliber round, especially with armor-piercing ammunition, could penetrate up to an inch of hardened steel at close range. At 500 yards, it still tore through thinner plating like paper. Field reports from Normandy and Italy recorded dozens of SD, KFZ, half-tracks shredded by American machine gun fire long before infantry could even dismount. Next came camouflage and concealment. German troops were trained to move in short bursts, staying low, hiding behind natural cover. But the .50's long range made even this dangerous. Its tracer rounds lit up everything in their path, exposing hidden positions and cutting through bushes and wooden structures. A single M2 on a hilltop could pin down a squad hundreds of meters away. "You couldn't hide from it," remembered one German grenadier. "It found you even when you thought you were invisible." Desperate for answers, the Wehrmacht tried using smoke screens and night attacks. The idea was to get close before the heavy guns could target them. Yet American units had learned to mount M2s on elevated pintle mounts or ring turrets, giving their gunners nearly 360 degrees of fire. Even in darkness, the gun's tracers guided the shooter. German night raids often ended in disaster, the attackers illuminated by their own muzzle flashes, while the Americans returned fire with devastating accuracy. The Luftwaffe also faced the M2's wrath. American bombers bristled with .50 caliber turrets, up to 13 on a single B-17 Flying Fortress. German engineers experimented with heavier armor glass, self-sealing fuel tanks, and frontal attack tactics to reduce exposure. But the M2's density of fire created an almost impenetrable wall. Every approach angle seemed lethal. German pilots began calling the bomber formations flying porcupines. Even the deadly FW-190 and Me-109 fighters struggled to get close without being shredded. On the ground, the Germans tried to outgun the Americans instead. They fielded the MG-42, the fastest-firing machine gun of the war, nearly twice the rate of the M2. It was a weapon of terrifying speed, but its 7.92 mm rounds lacked the raw power to match the .50 cal's reach. The MG-42 could suppress infantry. The M2 could destroy vehicles, walls, and even light bunkers. In countless battles, that difference decided who lived and who died. Some German units attempted counter-sniping tactics, targeting M2 gunners first. But the gun's mounting often placed the operator behind thick steel, especially on Sherman tanks or armored cars. In open-air jeeps, M2 teams were vulnerable. Yet those gunners learned to fire, relocate, and re-engage faster than their opponents could react. The result: every attempt to neutralize the weapon came at a terrible cost. The Wehrmacht's last hope was range. Could they stay far enough away to avoid its reach? Unfortunately, the M2's effective range stretched beyond 2,000 yards. Even anti-tank rifle teams, accustomed to striking from distance, found themselves outranged. As one German report bitterly noted in 1945, the American heavy machine gun has the precision of an artillery piece and the mobility of a rifle. By war's end, the Germans had built tanks that could withstand nearly everything except fear. The psychological weight of facing the .50 cal never disappeared. The sound of it alone was enough to freeze an advance or force a retreat. No matter how many armor plates they welded, or how many tactics they developed, the result was always the same. Every countermeasure failed because the M2 wasn't just a weapon, it was a system. Could be mounted anywhere, fired by anyone, and reparable in minutes. It never jammed, never overheated for long, and never stopped firing when it mattered. The Germans faced countless Allied weapons, but none so reliable, so adaptable, or so relentless. When the fighting finally stopped in 1945, captured Wehrmacht officers often mentioned one American weapon that impressed them the most, and terrified them just as deeply. It wasn't the tank. It wasn't the airplane. It was that simple, unstoppable gun they could never silence. The M2 had beaten not just their armor, it had beaten their ingenuity. High above Europe, the war took on a new dimension, one of clouds, fire, and metal. It was here, in the frozen skies over France, Germany, and the Low Countries, that the American M2.50 caliber machine gun earned its reputation as the defender of the bombers, the silent guardian that turned the sky into a deadly fortress. By 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force was sending hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into German airspace every week. Their mission: cripple the Reich's war machine. But before they could drop a single bomb, they had to survive the Luftwaffe, and the M2 was their only real shield. Each bomber bristled with .50 caliber guns, 13 on the B-17, 10 or more on the B-24, forming what pilots called a box of death. Nose, tail, top, belly, sides. Every approach was covered by twin barrels of American steel. German pilots soon learned that attacking a bomber head-on was suicide. The M2's reach was staggering. Its tracer rounds burned through the sky, creating fiery lines that pilots compared to walls of red lightning. The first major clash came over Schweinfurt in August 1943. Hundreds of German fighters swarmed the bomber formations, diving through the clouds in waves. The air was thick with tracer fire. Inside the bombers, the gunners gripped their twin .50s, the barrels glowing red-hot as they fired in short, desperate bursts. In the chaos, waist gunners shouted target calls over the intercom. "Focke-Wulf at 2 o'clock. He's diving!" And the thunder of the M2 drowned out everything else. Eyewitnesses described the sky as a living storm. The heavy guns rattled the fuselage, and the smell of cordite filled the air. Dozens of German fighters were ripped apart mid-dive, their engines shredded and wings torn off by concentrated bursts. The Luftwaffe's famed aces soon realized that every bomber they attacked was also a fortress armed with up to 24 gunners, each man ready to unleash hell. Still, the Germans adapted. They switched to frontal attacks, hoping to exploit the bombers' blind spots. But American engineers answered with chin turrets, twin M2s mounted under the nose of the B-17G. Changed everything. The next time the Luftwaffe came head-on, they met a curtain of fire so thick that even hardened pilots lost their nerve. Many turned away before getting within range. In combat reports, Luftwaffe survivors admitted the .50s were unlike anything they had faced before. One Me-109 pilot wrote, "Their bullets come from every direction. You cannot find the safe way in." Others called the bombers flying fortresses of lead. Even the mighty FW-190, known for its armor, often disintegrated after a few hits from .50 caliber rounds. For the American crews, the M2 was more than a weapon, it was a lifeline. Gunners gave their guns nicknames: Betty Lou, Sky Reaper, Sweet 16. They polished them, checked headspace and timing before every flight, and treated them with near-religious respect. In return, the M2 rarely failed them. Frozen oil, flak damage, or jammed belts. Somehow the gun kept firing. One remarkable story came from Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, a B-17 gunner who earned the Medal of Honor after defending his bomber during a mission over France in 1943. When enemy rounds set his aircraft ablaze and wounded his crew, Smith fought the fire, treated the wounded, and kept his .50s blazing for over 90 minutes, downing multiple attackers. The Germans later called that mission the day the sky caught fire. As the war dragged on, Luftwaffe losses mounted. By early 1945, they could barely replace the planes and pilots lost to the relentless defenses of the Allied bombers. Post-war analysis confirmed that the .50 caliber guns accounted for the vast majority of German fighter kills in air-to-air defense. The simplicity of the design, the high rate of fire, and the sheer number deployed turned the skies into a death trap for anyone who dared approach. When the last bombing runs flew over a shattered Berlin, the sound of the M2 still echoed above the ruins, a deep, metallic rhythm that symbolized American air power. German pilots who survived often admitted that they respected the gun more than any other Allied weapon. "We feared the .50 more than the flak," one veteran confessed. At least flak missed sometimes. The M2 had done what few weapons ever achieved. It reshaped the balance of power in the air. It made bomber formations nearly untouchable and turned courage into futility for the Luftwaffe. In the endless war between steel and willpower, the M2.50 cal proved that sometimes the simplest design could rule even the heavens.